Welcome to today's deep dive. And usually when we sit down to explore a topic for you, we're staring at just this massive stack of sources.
Oh, yeah. Piles of them.
Right, like dense academic research papers, lengthy historical articles, pages upon pages of our own notes, all waiting to be synthesized. But today is, well, it's highly unusual.
It really is.
Our entire source material today is literally just a single Wikipedia disambiguation page.
Just the raw menu.
Exactly, just the raw navigational menu for the term spring offensive.
Which is fascinating because it strips away all that narrative framing you usually expect when you're studying history.
Right, there's no spin.
Exactly. You aren't reading a curated textbook with, overarching theories or political justifications. You were just looking at cold, isolated data points.
Yeah.
And when you isolate the data points for spring offensive, you are forced to confront this rather humbling reality about human ambition.
Huge is.
That the timing of global history is largely dictated by something as seemingly mundane and entirely uncontrollable as the weather.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we like to think of history as being driven by visionary leaders or sudden technological advancements.
Massive ideological shifts.
Right. We build monuments to generals and draft endless treaties, but sometimes history is literally just waiting for the snow to melt.
It really is.
So our mission today is to discover how this one simple phrase serves as a connective thread running through more than 150 years of human conflict, and how that strictly military taxonomy eventually bleeds over into our culture and art.
And if you look at the sheer volume of military campaigns on this page that share this exact name, it's a remarkable way to trace a global chronology of conflict.
Yeah, it's a huge list.
It is. If you read down the military list, you take a localized, yet entirely global tour of warfare, starting all the way back in the mid-19th century.
Yeah, the very first bullet point takes us to 1849. It lists the Spring Campaign, which was a major offensive during the Hungarian War of Independence.
And to understand the implications of that, we have to imagine the pure physical toll of warfare in 1849.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we are talking about an era long before mechanized transport.
Sure.
The logistical nightmare of moving an army relied almost entirely on horses.
Horses and just incredibly rudimentary supply lines.
Right. And soldiers marching on foot across really rugged Eastern European terrain.
Yeah.
In the dead of winter, foraging for food becomes completely impossible. Pack animals starve. Humans freeze. The military apparatus simply cannot function until the earth thaws out.
It's just a hard pause on human ambition. But then you fast forward into the 20th century and the term just explodes across the historical record.
So he does.
The source highlights Ludendorff's 1918 German spring offensive in World War I.
Right.
Then jumping to World War II, there are two separate entries in the exact same region. You've got the Italian spring offensive of the 1941 Greco-Italian War, and then the Allied spring 1945 offensive in Italy.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the transition from 1849 to 1918 and then to 1945 represents a monumental shift in human destructive capability.
Oh, massive.
You go from muskets and cavalry charges to the industrialized slaughter, the trench networks, and the chemical warfare of World War I.
Yeah.
Then you leap forward to massive mechanized logistics, armor divisions, air supremacy in World War II. Everything about the technology of violence changed radically.
The machinery evolved completely, but the calendar remained the absolute authority.
Yes.
Because a 30-ton tank in the Apennine Mountains in 1945 is just as susceptible to a winter freeze or a washed-out muddy mountain pass as a horse-drawn supply cart was a century earlier.
Exactly. Which brings us to the geographic and ideological scope of this list. Because if this naming convention were isolated to just European land wars, it might just be a regional quirk.
Sure, just a localized tradition.
Right. But the document broadens out significantly. Right after the World War I entry, we see the 1919 Spring Offensive of the White Army during the Russian Civil War.
Navigating the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Russian steppe.
Exactly. And jumping ahead again past World War II, the document lists the Chinese Spring Offensive of 1951, taking place during the Korean War.
Wow.
So we are looking at Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, the frozen expanses of Russia, and the mountainous Korean peninsula.
It's wild to see an empire in 1918, the Allied forces in 1945, the White Army in 1919, and Chinese forces in 1951, all using the exact same playbook.
The exact same one.
And they operate under completely different motivations, completely different structures of government, and fight completely different enemies.
Right.
So why? Is this just a persistent military tradition, or is there a hard tactical reason why this specific season keeps getting triggered across all these eras?
To answer that, we can look at one of the most recent historical entries on the page.
Okay.
The text includes a highly specific detail regarding the war in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
It lists spring offensive and notes various, and then defines the Taliban's use of the term as the annual restart of fighting after the end of winter.
The annual restart of fighting.
Yeah.
That phrasing is incredibly telling. It treats war almost like a seasonal crop.
It does. And that single definition is really the tactical key to understanding the entire document. Because warfare, stripped of its politics, is an exercise in logistics.
Right. The math of moving things.
Exactly. It is the complex mathematics of moving calories, ammunition, and medical supplies over hostile terrain. Winter forces a systemic stagnation.
Yeah.
In a theater like Afghanistan, winter means the high mountain passes of the Hindu Kush are choked with meters of impassable snow. The Taliban's logistical network, which relies heavily on those mountain trails and smuggling routes, just grinds to a halt.
You aren't just fighting the enemy at that point.
No, you're fighting hypothermia and the sheer physics of moving mass over ice.
It forces a hard pause. The conflict is literally frozen in place until the environment permits movement again.
And so spring becomes the inevitable biological restart button. The snow melts, the passes open, and troops can mobilize. But it is important to note that spring brings its own brutal logistical hurdles.
No, right, the mud.
Yes. Military historians often point to the phenomena of the Rasputitsa in Eastern Europe, the mud seasons where the melting snow turns the unpaved terrain into a bottomless soup that swallows tanks and trucks whole.
Just a nightmare for armor.
But that mud is a transitional brutality. It is the agonizing middle step between the paralysis of winter and the firm ground of summer. So the Taliban, using the term for an annual restart, perfectly encapsulates the tactical reality faced by the Hungarians in 1849 and the Allies in 1945.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material brings up another major conflict that shifts the environmental context completely.
Right.
The text explicitly mentions the Vietnam War. It gives us two separate examples. First, the Easter Offensive, specified as a spring 1972 North Vietnamese offensive, and then the 1975 Spring Offensive, also launched by the North Vietnamese.
And looking at the Vietnam examples forces us to broaden our understanding of seasonal strategy.
And as a quick reminder, as you are listening, our focus here is entirely on the historical timeline and the terminology drawn straight from our source text. We are looking at the persistent strategy across eras, completely independent of the politics or ideologies of the conflicts themselves. We just want to make that clear.
Absolutely, because the underlying tactical truth remains the same, regardless of the specific climate zone.
Right.
In Vietnam, we are no longer discussing the deep freezes of the Russian winter or the snow-choked passes of Afghanistan. We are talking about Southeast Asia, a drastically different climate defined heavily by intense monsoon seasons.
Right. The rain.
Right. So a spring offensive often meant timing a massive coordinated military push before the heavy monsoon rains arrived, because those rays would turn the Ho Chi Minh Trail into an impassable quagmire.
It's still weather dictating terms.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea that launching an offensive isn't simply about amassing enough weapons or having superior troop morale. It is about syncing your strategic objectives with the inescapable rhythm of the planet.
And there is a fascinating meta detail hidden right at the bottom of this Wikipedia page that proves just how deeply ingrained this concept is in the global military apparatus.
I love this part.
Right. Under the See Also section, the page points the reader to two entirely separate disambiguation pages, one for summer offensive and another for winter offensive.
It reveals a massive, overarching taxonomy of warfare. Military historians and the commanders drafting the battle plans themselves consistently categorize human conflict by the time of year it takes place.
Yeah.
The fact that summer and winter offensives require their own dedicated navigational menus highlights how universal this constraint is. The seasons don't merely provide a scenic backdrop for historical events. They provide the fundamental organizational structure for them.
What's haunting, though, is how this strictly military taxonomy eventually bleeds off the battlefield and into our culture.
It really is.
Because the source document transitions from the military section to a section simply titled Other Uses. And you see this profound psychological shift where the language of logistics and troop movements becomes the language of art.
It is a perfect illustration of how society processes generational trauma. The raw data points of a military campaign eventually morph into emotional resonance. The terminology of the tactician is inherited by the poet,
And the very first entry under other uses is a poem titled Spring Offensive, written by Wilfred Owen about World War I.
which creates a deeply poignant connection within the document itself.
Yeah.
Because earlier in the military timeline, the text listed Ludendorff's massive 1918 German Spring Offensive during World War I. And now in the cultural section, we have Wilfred Owen, arguably the most renowned war poet of his generation, utilizing that exact phrase.
He experienced the grim reality of that annual restart firsthand on the Western Front.
He lived the logistical nightmare we've been discussing, and Owen's history is incredibly tragic. He was killed in action just a week before the armistice.
Just heartbreaking.
He understood the cruel irony of the phrase better than anyone. He took a term used by generals sitting in comfortable command tents to describe lines moving on a map, and he used it to explore the profound tragedy of young men marching into machine gun fire, right as the natural world around them is waking up and blooming.
Yeah.
The poem juxtaposes the beauty of spring flowers with the freshly dug trenches of the battlefield. It is the ultimate subversion of the season of rebirth.
But that artistic processing of the term didn't stop 100 years ago with the poetry of the First World War.
Not at all.
The source text tracks how the phrase continues to echo into modern music. Right below the Wilfred Owen entry, the text lists a British indie rock band that simply named themselves Spring Offensive.
It shows how generations removed from the trenches of the Western Front, artists are still inheriting the vocabulary of war. A modern music group choosing a name associated with a century and a half of global combat takes a phrase heavily laden with the weight of historical violence and repurposes it for a totally different kind of cultural expression.
And the entry that truly crystallizes this cultural shift is a 2010 album by an artist named Soul.
Yes.
The document lists the title as Spring Offensive Volume 1, Nuclear Winter Remixes.
As an example of synthesizing historical concepts into something entirely new, that album title is brilliant.
It really is.
It operates on a massive scale of linguistic contrast.
You have Spring Offensive placed directly against Nuclear Winter.
Right. Think about the tactical reality of a spring offensive that we've established today for you listening. It represents the thawing of the ice. It requires movement, pushing forward, the annual restart of human activity, and the traditional biological rebirth associated with the season.
Right.
It is inherently dynamic, aggressive, and active.
The snow melts, the mud eventually hardens, and the troops march forward.
Exactly. Then the artist pairs that dynamic, forward-moving historical phrase with nuclear winter. And nuclear winter is the conceptual opposite. It is the ultimate apocalyptic stagnation. It represents a man-made radioactive freeze from which there is no spring thaw, no opening of the mountain passes, and no subsequent restart.
It is the absolute end of the timeline.
Yes. You have the ultimate violent push of human history paired with the ultimate catastrophic consequence of human history.
The contrast is just heavy.
By locking those two phrases together, Spring Offensive and Nuclear Winter, the title creates an incredible thematic tension. It takes the historical weight of the military taxonomy we just spent all this time unpacking and flips it to make a statement about modern existential dread.
Yeah.
Pulling that level of meaning out of a single bullet point on a navigational web page is a testament to how dense with inherited history these phrases really are.
It really is. And that brings us to the end of our source document, which means it is time to wrap up this deep dive.
It flew by.
It did. We started with what appeared to be the driest source material imaginable, a sparse, bulleted list of links. But by examining the context behind those links, we uncovered a sweeping story about human nature and our relationship with the environment.
Completely.
From the horse-drawn supply lines at the Hungarian War of Independence in 1849 to the mechanized armor of World War II, through the monsoons of Vietnam and the snow-choked passes of Afghanistan, we saw how the changing of the seasons has consistently dictated the rhythm of human history.
Right.
We saw how that persistent rhythm was so psychologically powerful that it bled off the battlefield, shaping the tragic poetry of Wilfred Owen, the naming conventions of British indie rock bands, and the layered wordplay of modern music.
Yeah.
History isn't just a linear list of dates. It operates on a cycle. And for over a century and a half, that cycle has been strictly bound to the arrival of spring. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We will be back next time to unpack another stack of sources for you and see what else we can discover together.
But before we go, consider this. If human warfare and the very concept of a spring offensive have historically been entirely dependent on predictable seasonal weather patterns, If armies relied on knowing exactly when the winter freeze would stall logistics and when the spring thaw would allow fighting to restart, what happens next? We are entering an era of modern climate change, characterized by unpredictable extreme weather, where the seasons no longer operate on the strict, reliable schedules they once did. If the weather becomes permanently chaotic, how will that alter the fundamental timing and strategy of future global conflicts? Will the concept of a spring offensive even exist in a world where the seasons themselves are shifting?